The war was already a monster by the time I was conscripted. It had chewed through the men who were my friends and comrades, my brothers in arms, leaving nothing behind but blood-streaked trenches and the stench of death. When the war began, we all thought it would end quickly. We were young, full of patriotism, marching proudly under the imperial flag. But by 1917 we had learned the harsh truth. There was no quick end to this madness. The front had become a graveyard. The enemy was no longer just a faceless foe. There were men, too, fighting for their survival. And the earth was broken, split open by shells, cratered and scarred, as if it too had been consumed by the conflict. But still, we fought on. I was 30 years old then, older than most of the young lads being conscripted into the regular army, and yet I wasn't immune from the summons. I had seen the early days of the war, the exhilaration of marching off to battle, the naive confidence that came with youth. But those days were long gone. The enemy, the British and French, had thrown us into the dirt and mud of the trenches, and it had broken something inside all of us. We were no longer soldiers, but survivors, no longer men of honor, but pawns in a war of attrition that seemed destined to last forever. The Stormtroopers were a new idea, a desperate one. By 1917, the generals had grown frustrated with the deadlock on the Western Front. The standard infantry assault tactics weren't working anymore. We needed a new way to fight, fast, efficient, brutal, and that was where we came in. When I first heard of the Stormtrooper units, I didn't know what to think. I had survived the trenches, fought in several of the early battles like Verdun, but now, at 30, I was being pulled into something even more dangerous. The officers didn't have time for hesitation. You either stepped up or you didn't. We were given a brief, hasty training. They pushed us to our limits. Bayonet drills, grenade training, and how to coordinate with flamethrower teams. We had to learn how to move like shadows, infiltrating enemy positions and striking where they were weakest. But what they didn't prepare us for, what no one prepared us for, was the fear. The fear of fighting face to face, of seeing the enemy in the eyes just a few meters away, knowing that one of us would die in the next breath. Before I continue with my story, a quick reminder to like and subscribe. If you want more stories from the heart of history, make sure to leave a comment and share it. Now back to my tale. I can still feel the weight of the coal scuttle helmet on my head, a piece of metal designed to protect us from shrapnel, but never from the fear. The steel plate strapped to our chest felt heavy, like a coffin that had yet to be sealed. It wasn't enough to protect us from the nightmare that awaited us. We learned to move in small, swift teams, using the cover of darkness, slipping into enemy lines without making a sound. Our MP-18 submachine guns were supposed to be our salvation, our primary weapon for close combat. The first time I fired it, the recoil nearly sent me off balance. But the power of the weapon was undeniable. The sound of it, loud and violent, was something I would never forget. But as we trained, I began to question everything. Was this all for glory, or were we just tools for a desperate regime, sending us to die in battles we could never win? The men who had come with me seemed just as confused. Some were young boys who had never seen a day of combat. Others were older men like me, broken by the war. The commanders kept telling us that this was the key to victory. We were the elite, the chosen ones who would break the enemy's lines. but no one told us that we were being sent to the heart of the hellfire. The reality of war sank in as soon as we were deployed. The first battle I participated in was a nightmare. We were dropped into the hellscape of no man's land, a barren stretch of land filled with craters, barbed wire, and the dead. The ground shook with every explosion. The smell of burning flesh and gunpowder filled the air, making it hard to breathe. The enemy's artillery rained down on us, but we had no choice but to push forward. Every step felt like a death sentence. The adrenaline coursed through my veins, but beneath it all was a deep dread, a feeling that no matter how fast we moved, no matter how much we pushed forward, we could never outrun death. The MP-18 felt like a weight in my hands, but it was also a lifeline. The first time I squeezed the trigger, the bullets cut through the air like a deadly symphony. The recoil was violent, but it allowed me to keep moving. I ducked behind craters, firing into enemy lines as I advanced. The chaos around me was indescribable. Men screamed, explosions rang out, and the world seemed to slow down. I remember seeing my first enemy soldier. He was young, just a boy, really, crouched in the mud, trying to reload his rifle. Our eyes locked for just a moment, and in that moment I saw the fear in his eyes. He was just like me. But the next moment the training took over. I fired, he dropped. The world moved on. That was the moment I realized what war was truly about. It wasn't about honor or glory, it was about survival, about living to see another moment. And in that moment I understood why they called us Sturmtruppen, the Stormtroopers. We were not men anymore. We were weapons, designed to tear through the enemy and leave nothing behind. It was the only way to survive. The first real taste of battle came at the Battle of Cambrai in late 1917. We stormtroopers were part of the initial assault, the vanguard of the Sturmtruppen. It was a new kind of warfare, a method designed to bypass the enemy's entrenched positions, to infiltrate their rear lines and create chaos. But it was also something more. It was a gamble, and in war, there's no such thing as a sure bet. The night before the attack, I couldn't sleep. The noise from the artillery was deafening, even though we were far behind the front lines. The ground shook with every shell that exploded, and the anticipation made my heart race. The officers gave us our orders early the next morning. The plan was simple: break through the British defenses, bypass their fortifications, and hit them where they were weakest. We would be the spearhead, the ones to break the enemy's will. I remember the air, thick with smoke and the scent of burning earth. The ground shook beneath my feet as the artillery thundered overhead, and I could feel the vibrations of the shells deep in my chest. There was a strange kind of stillness before the assault. In that silence, I remember feeling both dread and anticipation. We were about to step into hell. We were armed with the MP-18 submachine guns, grenades, and trench knives. The plan was to get in, close with the enemy, and destroy their positions at close range. The Sturmtruppen were not about holding ground. We were about breaking through and causing chaos. We were trained to infiltrate, to move swiftly, and to fight without mercy. The first wave of soldiers went in, and I followed behind them, sprinting through the muddy battlefield, my heart pounding in my chest. The sight was chaotic, men running, falling, and crawling. The enemy was in disarray, just as we had been trained to anticipate. But there was no time to think about the enemy's confusion. We had our own problems. problems that came with every step we took forward. As I moved deeper into the enemy's position, I saw the first British soldier. He was crouched behind a sandbag, rifle raised, eyes wide with fear. For a moment, we locked eyes, and then I did it. I fired. The impact was immediate, but the fear lingered. This man, he was someone's son, someone's brother. But in that moment, it didn't matter. The training kicked in. The mission came first. I moved on, sprinting across the battlefield where the carnage was already mounting. The air was thick with smoke, and every breath I took tasted of gunpowder and death. The MP-18 was a marvel. Its recoil was manageable, and the bullets ripped through the enemy lines with ease. I fired from the hip, cutting down soldiers in my path, but every time I pulled the trigger I wondered, how much of this was for glory? How much of this was for survival? The battle dragged on for hours, but the initial success of the Stormtroopers' breakthrough was undeniable. The confusion we created behind enemy lines was enough to cause havoc in their command. Still, the war wasn't won in one day, and the toll it took on us, on me, was immense. The blood we spilled was nothing compared to what we would see in the months to come. The war had long ceased to be about glory. By the time we pushed into the heart of enemy lines during the spring offensive of 1918, we had all become ghosts of the men we once were. The ground had become a deadly labyrinth of craters and broken bodies, and every step felt like an act of defiance against the inevitable. It was a storm of madness, and we were its unwilling architects. We had been given a single clear goal: break through the British lines and create chaos deep behind enemy territory. It was a task that felt almost absurd, especially now. The enemy was well entrenched, their defenses as hardened as our resolve had once been. But we were stormtroopers, trained to adapt, to infiltrate, to move in the shadows like predators. The night before the assault, I found myself staring at the faintest flickers of light in the distance. The artillery barrage had started hours earlier, and the ground shook beneath my boots. The air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning oil. In the distance, flares shot into the night sky like signals from another world. There was something eerily surreal about it all, as if we were not preparing for war, but something far worse. I could hear my comrades around me, their nervous whispers mixing with the distant thud of artillery. We were all exhausted, our bodies and minds battered from months of relentless fighting. No one spoke of glory anymore. We had long abandoned such thoughts. Now it was about survival, plain and simple. We moved out under the cover of darkness, advancing in small, silent groups. The ground was muddy and the smell of rotting flesh and smoke filled my lungs. The MP-18 felt heavy in my hands, but it was comforting too. It was the one thing that felt solid, reliable. The darkness, however, was a different story. In the shadows, we were all equal. Men and boys, soldiers and civilians, all reduced to the same basic instinct: survival. The battle began with an explosion of noise that sent us into a frenzy. The enemy's machine guns began firing, and their flares illuminated the night sky, casting an eerie glow on everything. The ground around us erupted in flashes of light, and for a moment I lost all sense of time. Everything became noise, movement, and chaos. I sprinted forward, diving into the nearest trench, the sound of gunfire rattling my bones. My heart raced, and I could hear the blood pounding in my ears. This was it. This was the fight we had trained for. the battle that would define us. And yet, in the back of my mind, a voice whispered the truth I had already known. It would not matter. This war had no winners, only survivors. The first British soldier I encountered was a young man, no older than 18. He was crouched behind a sandbag, shaking, his rifle aimed at me. Our eyes met, and in that brief instant I saw everything: fear, confusion, and the same helplessness I had felt for so long. But there was no time for hesitation. I fired, the man dropped, and just like that, the world moved on. We pushed forward through the trenches, clearing them one by one. The enemy was disoriented, retreating under the weight of our advance. The chaos of battle was intoxicating. The fear mixed with adrenaline, and there was a strange euphoria in it, a feeling of power that came from being in the midst of the storm. But it was fleeting. I could already feel the weight of the bodies piling up in my mind, the faces of the men I had killed, their eyes haunting me in the silence between the explosions. As we advanced, I could hear the cries of wounded men from both sides. The noise was deafening: shouts, screams, the sickening thud of bodies falling. The sound of the MP-18 firing in rapid bursts became a backdrop to the madness. I kept moving, one foot in front of the other, as the chaos surrounded me. The world felt unreal, like a dream I couldn't escape from. In the midst of it all, I saw a group of soldiers, young men who could barely be called that, really. They were barely old enough to shave, their faces pale with fear. They were part of the Hitler Youth, boys forced into this war by a regime that didn't care whether they lived or died. For a moment, I saw something familiar in their eyes. Fear, yes, but also a kind of numb resignation. They were just boys, no different from me at that age. I moved alongside them, fighting through the enemy positions together. It was strange, this camaraderie born from necessity. We didn't talk much, didn't exchange many words, but there was a shared understanding between us all. We were here because we had no choice, and we would fight because we had no other option. By the time we reached the final objective, we'd made significant progress, but I could feel the toll it had taken. The men around me were as exhausted as I was. Some had fallen, others were too wounded to continue, and yet we pushed on, driven by the orders we had received, knowing full well that victory was an illusion. That night, as we made camp behind enemy lines, I found myself reflecting on everything that had led me here. I had been a soldier once, full of purpose, but that man had died long ago. All that remained was a survivor, hollowed out by the horrors I had seen. In the distance, the enemy continued to fire, their guns and mortars sending death into the night. But I didn't feel fear anymore. I felt something worse, an empty numbness that filled the void where hope once resided. The battle for Cambrai was far from over. We had made our breakthrough, but the cost was unimaginable. And as I lay there staring at the stars above, I couldn't help but wonder how much longer I could keep fighting, how much longer any of us could. The days following the assault on Cambrai were a blur of fatigue, blood, and shattered minds. We had broken through the enemy's lines, but the victory felt hollow. The landscape around us was strewn with the debris of war. Craters, wrecked machines and bodies, some still moving, others forever still. It was a scene I would carry with me for the rest of my life, a landscape of death that would haunt my dreams. We pushed deeper into enemy territory, our advance slow and deliberate. The initial euphoria of success faded quickly as the reality of the war sank back in. This was not a triumph. It was merely another chapter in a long, brutal conflict that seemed to have no end. Every step we took forward felt like a step deeper into hell, and the further we went, the more we lost ourselves in the madness. The constant barrage of artillery fire never stopped. It became the soundtrack of our existence. The ground seemed to tremble with every shell that exploded, and the air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and death. It was as though the war had become part of the landscape itself, a permanent fixture in the world we inhabited. And yet, we kept moving, one foot in front of the other, driven by something we could no longer name. The men around me were changing. Some became quiet, withdrawn, while others seemed to be losing their grip on reality altogether. We had all seen death, felt the weight of it, but now it was becoming something else, something we couldn't escape. I watched as one of the younger soldiers, barely 18, was overcome with fear. He had never been in combat before, and the sheer terror of it had broken him. He stumbled, his eyes wide with panic, and muttered to himself about how he couldn't do it anymore. The officers shouted at him, urging him to keep moving, but it was no use. In the end, he collapsed, his mind fractured by the horrors around him. I didn't even know his name, but I remembered his face, the look of sheer terror that would never leave me. The Stormtroopers were once the pride of the German army, hailed as the elite, the ones who could turn the tide of battle. But now, as I looked around at the faces of my comrades, I saw nothing but exhaustion. We were no longer soldiers, but broken men, each one carrying the weight of countless deaths, each one struggling to hold on to whatever part of their humanity had not yet been consumed by the war. We reached the enemy's secondary defenses days later, and the battle was relentless. The British forces had regrouped, and their resistance was more organized, more determined. The assault became a brutal slog, with no room for tactics or strategy, just pure, unrelenting violence. We fought from trench to trench, pushing forward inch by inch, our bodies battered, our minds frazzled by the constant noise and bloodshed. I could feel the toll it was taking on me. My hands shook from the constant tension, my thoughts scattered by the unending noise of war. The only thing that kept me going was the instinct to survive. I had learned long ago that in this war, survival was a victory in itself, but even survival came with a price. One night, as we dug in behind a newly captured trench, I caught sight of a group of soldiers from the Hitler Youth, boys no older than 16, armed with rifles and grenades, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and determination. They had been thrust into this war by a government that cared little for their lives. I watched as they huddled together, speaking in hushed voices, trying to reassure one another. They were so young, so full of life, yet they were here, in the heart of this madness, forced to fight in a war they did not understand. It reminded me of my own youth, of the idealism that had once driven me to fight for a cause that seemed just. But now, in the midst of this nightmare, that idealism seemed like a distant memory. We were not fighting for glory anymore. We were fighting to survive, to make it through another day. I was pulled from my thoughts by the sound of approaching enemy troops. The battle erupted around us with a sudden ferocity. The Stormtroopers fought with all the skill and precision we had been trained for, but it felt like we were pushing against a tidal wave. The British forces were relentless, and the carnage was unimaginable. The sound of gunfire, the screams of the wounded, and the explosions filled the air, drowning out everything else. It was chaos, pure and simple. I found myself facing another enemy soldier, this one older than the boy I had killed during the first battle. His eyes were cold, calculating as he leveled his rifle at me. But in that moment, I hesitated. For the briefest of moments, I saw a flicker of humanity in his eyes. He was just a man, no different from me. We were both trapped in this war, both driven to kill in order to survive. But there was no time for hesitation. The rifle cracked and he fell. I didn't even know if he was dead. I didn't care. The fight continued for hours, and by the end of it, we had taken the position. But the victory felt empty. We had lost more men, and I had lost a piece of myself. The cost of victory was becoming clearer with each passing day. We had advanced, but at what cost? How much more of ourselves could we give to this war before there was nothing left? That night, as I lay in the mud, the stench of death still thick in the air, I couldn't help but wonder if any of this was worth it. The war had consumed everything, our youth, our hope, our humanity. And in the end, there would be no winners. There would only be survivors. The war had a way of wearing you down piece by piece until you no longer recognized yourself. By the time we reached the end of our campaign near the Hindenburg Line, I was no longer the man who had eagerly marched off to battle in the early days. I had become something else, something hollowed out, a mere echo of the soldier I had once been. The war had stolen my youth, my hope, and my humanity, leaving behind only a shell. We had been thrust into battle again and again, with no respite, no time to mourn the comrades we had lost. Each assault was followed by another, each trench raid more desperate than the last. The British had dug in deep, their positions reinforced, and the fighting had become a brutal slog. There was no room for tactics anymore, just sheer, unrelenting violence. The men around me had all changed. Some had become numb, no longer reacting to the constant explosions, while others had snapped, their minds shattered by the constant barrage of noise and bloodshed. One evening, as we dug into a newly captured trench, I found myself staring at the sky. It had been a long time since I had seen the stars. The war had consumed everything. Our world had become the battlefield, and the sky above had been forgotten. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to remember what life had been like before the war, the days of peace, the days of innocence. I had been a man then, full of dreams and ambitions. But now those days seemed as distant as the stars themselves. I could hear the men around me, their murmurs lost in the wind. There was no laughter anymore, no camaraderie. We were all just survivors now, waiting for the next assault, the next wave of death to come crashing down on us. The faces of the men around me had become blurs. There was no longer time to get to know each other. We were all just interchangeable parts in a machine that ground us down, one battle at a time. The night was cold, and the rain began to fall, turning the mud into a slick, treacherous mess. It was then that I saw him, a young soldier barely 15, his eyes wide with terror as he looked at the battlefield around him. He was part of the Hitler Youth, just another boy who had been forced into this war. I watched as he clutched his rifle, his hands trembling. The look in his eyes reminded me of the first time I had been thrust into combat, full of fear and uncertainty. I tried to speak to him, to offer some kind of comfort, but the words wouldn't come. I didn't know what to say. There was no comfort in this war, no solace to be found. The boy's fear was contagious, and I could feel it gnawing at me as well. The war had taken everything from us, the hope, the pride, the purpose, and replaced it with fear, confusion, and death. The battle resumed the next day as we pushed forward through the rain and mud. The British had regrouped, their positions heavily fortified, and we were met with fierce resistance. The chaos of battle was overwhelming. The sound of artillery was deafening, and the air was thick with smoke and the scent of burning flesh. I fought on instinct, no longer thinking, no longer feeling. I just moved, ducking behind craters, firing from the hip, trying to survive. But as I moved deeper into the enemy's position, I saw the first signs of the collapse that had been creeping up on me. The men around me, once strong and determined, were now broken. Some had lost the will to fight, others were simply too exhausted to continue. I saw one of my comrades, a man who had once been my closest friend, kneeling in the mud, his rifle hanging loosely at his side. His face was blank, his eyes distant. It was then that I realized the war had taken him, just as it had taken all of us. We fought on, but the lines were breaking. The Stormtroopers, once the elite of the army, were now little more than desperate survivors, clinging to the hope that the war would end before it consumed all of us. But deep down, we knew the truth. There was no end in sight. The war would continue until there was nothing left, nothing but ruins and the ghosts of the men who had fought it. As the battle raged around me, I found myself questioning everything. What was the point of all this? We had fought for so long, pushed through so much pain and loss, but for what? The enemy was still there, still fighting, and we were no closer to victory. The more I fought, the more I realized that this war was not about glory or honor. It was about survival, and even survival came at a cost. The days blurred together as we moved from one battle to the next. I lost track of the names of the men who had fallen beside me. Their faces became indistinguishable, their deaths just another casualty in a war that had long since ceased to make sense. We had no purpose anymore, no cause to fight for. The government that had sent us to the front lines was crumbling, and with it, any hope we had left. The psychological toll was taking its toll on all of us. Men who had once been strong and resolute were now broken, their minds shattered by the horrors of war. I saw one soldier, a boy I'd fought alongside from the beginning, sitting in the corner of a trench, his eyes vacant, his rifle by his side. He didn't speak anymore. He didn't react when the artillery fire exploded nearby. He was lost, and I knew deep down that he would never come back. As the battle for the Hindenburg Line continued, I found myself at a breaking point. The constant violence, the endless march forward, had worn me down. I had nothing left, no strength, no hope, no will to fight. I was a soldier, yes, but I was also a man on the brink of collapse, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could keep going. The battle for the Hindenburg Line seemed endless. Each day blended into the next, a blur of gunfire, screams, and the relentless pounding of artillery. We had been fighting for so long that we no longer knew what victory was supposed to feel like. We were simply trying to survive, each of us clinging to the hope that somehow it would all end. But deep down, We knew that the war was not just breaking our bodies, it was shattering something far deeper. The part of us that had once believed in something greater than survival. We had fought for months without a break, and every man who survived carried with him the weight of countless deaths. My comrades had changed, some more than others. The Stormtroopers, once the pride of the German army, were now a disjointed group of men, boys, and broken souls. The young soldiers, some of them no older than 15, had never known peace. Their faces were gaunt, their eyes hollow, and the fear was always there, just beneath the surface. The older men, like me, carried the weight of years on the front lines. The memories of better days, of family and home, seemed like distant dreams. As the days wore on, the fear grew stronger. We could hear the rumble of the enemy's advance, feel the ground shake as their artillery fire rained down upon us. The air was thick with the acrid smell of smoke and the stench of death. The British were pushing forward, relentless in their pursuit, and we were being driven back, inch by inch. The positions we had once held with pride were now crumbling under the weight of the onslaught. I could feel the walls closing in. The ground beneath us felt unstable, as though the very earth was giving way to the destruction we had wrought. I found myself retreating deeper into my own mind, seeking any shred of comfort I could find. But there was no comfort here, no escape from the madness that had consumed us all. The war had become a part of us, as natural and inevitable as the air we breathed. I was no longer sure what I was fighting for. The idealism that had driven me to the front lines in the beginning was long gone, replaced by something far darker: survival. We had lost so many men, and every day brought more death. It was no longer about honor or glory. It was about staying alive, one more day. And in the back of my mind, I wondered how much longer I could keep going. How much longer could any of us? One afternoon, as we prepared to face another assault, I found myself staring at a soldier who had once been a friend. His face was covered in dirt, his uniform torn, but his eyes were what struck me most. There was nothing left in them, no fear, no hope, just an empty emptiness. I had seen that look before in others who had broken under the strain of the war, but seeing it in him, someone I had once known, made it all too real. We were all breaking, slowly, inexorably. "Do you think it will end soon?" he asked, his voice barely audible over the sound of artillery fire. I didn't have an answer. How could I? The war had become something that transcended our hopes and fears. It was a force of nature, a storm that could not be controlled, only endured. I looked away, not knowing what to say. What could I say? The truth was that we were all just waiting for the end. Whether it came in the form of an armistice, death, or something else entirely, we had no control over it anymore. The next assault came with the fury of 1,000 storms. The enemy was upon us, their artillery tearing through the air, their infantry charging forward with relentless determination. We fought back as best as we could, but we were outnumbered, outgunned, and exhausted. The positions we had held were lost, one by one, until there was nothing left but the shattered remains of what had once been our front lines. As the fighting raged on, I found myself caught in the chaos. I could hear the screams of the wounded, the crack of rifle fire, the thunder of artillery. My MP-18 was in my hands, but it felt heavier than ever before. I fired instinctively, moving from one position to another, but my mind was elsewhere, drifting, lost in the noise of war. Then, amid the chaos, I saw him, a British soldier, barely more than a boy. He was standing in the open, his rifle raised, his eyes wide with fear. I froze, and for a moment I felt something stir within me. It wasn't hatred or fear, but something else, something that had been buried deep inside me, something I hadn't felt in a long time. The boy lowered his rifle, his hands trembling. I saw the fear in his eyes, the same fear I had felt countless times on the battlefield. We were the same in that moment. Just two men, caught in a war we didn't understand, fighting because we had no choice. But before I could do anything, I saw a flash of movement and the boy dropped. The shot had come from behind me, a fellow soldier who had taken the opportunity to eliminate the threat. The boy's body crumpled to the ground, and I felt a cold emptiness settle over me. The battle continued, but I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at the boy's lifeless body, wondering if there was any point to any of this. The war had become a blur. The lines between friend and foe, right and wrong, had all blurred together. There was no honor, no glory, no reason. There was only survival, and even that felt increasingly elusive. By the time the enemy finally broke through, it was too late. The fighting was over, but the cost of victory, of survival, was too great. We had won, yes, but at what cost? How many of us would remain when the dust settled? How many of us would even be able to return to the lives we had once known, if there was even a life left to return to? We had been fighting for so long that the line between soldier and survivor had become impossibly thin. By the time we reached the final stages of the war, everything had started to blur. Our goals, our missions, even our names. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were just bodies, moving through the wreckage of what had once been a world full of meaning and purpose. The news that the war was nearing its end reached us in the midst of another attack. But it was hard to believe, hard to grasp the idea that the endless cycle of death might finally come to a stop. We had heard rumors before, whispers of peace, but they always seemed like distant dreams, things that belonged to someone else, someone far away who wasn't living the nightmare we were stuck in. The battlefield around us was more like a graveyard than anything else. The land was scorched, the earth littered with the remains of both sides, the bodies of men who had fought for a cause that no longer seemed to matter. The soldiers who remained were mere shadows of the men who had marched proudly into battle years ago. The fear was still there, yes, but it was tempered by something worse. Resignation. We were no longer fighting for victory. We were fighting to survive, because survival had become the only thing that mattered, and even that felt like a hollow victory. I still remember the day we were told that the Germans had signed an armistice. It felt like a distant echo, something that happened to someone else, not us. It was too late for us, too late for the men who had already given everything, too late for those who had been left behind in the trenches, their bodies abandoned to rot. For a brief moment, I allowed myself to think of peace, of going home, but then the reality of it hit me. There was no going home, not really, not after what we had seen, after what we had done. The orders came quickly after that: retreat, fall back to our last lines and prepare for the final defense. The enemy was closing in, their artillery fire louder now, relentless. We dug in, each man clinging to whatever shred of hope remained, even though we knew it was futile. The end was coming, but we weren't ready for it. We had never been prepared for this moment. The soldiers around me were silent, their eyes hollow. They had given everything they had, and now they had nothing left. I stood beside them, watching the smoke billow up from the enemy's artillery, feeling the ground tremble beneath me. The enemy was coming, but this time there was no grand charge, no heroic last stand. There was only the quiet, inevitable realization that we were beaten. The enemy was at our gates, and we had nothing left to fight with. The young soldiers around me, those who had joined the ranks just months before, were barely holding it together. Their faces were pale, their bodies shaking from exhaustion and fear. These were the boys who had been told they would save the Reich, the ones who had been thrown into the war with no understanding of what it truly meant to fight. I saw one of them, barely 16, standing at the edge of the trench, staring out at the smoke and the chaos. He was barely a boy, and yet here he was, caught in the madness of a war that had taken everything from us all. I had seen that look in the eyes of too many soldiers, the look of someone who knew that there would be no winners in this war, only survivors. The orders came to fall back further. The front was crumbling, and we had no choice but to retreat. The enemy was on our heels, and there was no time for ceremony, no time for goodbyes. We moved back through the shattered remnants of what had once been our positions, dragging our feet through the muck and the blood-soaked earth. There was nothing left to fight for. The war was lost, and all that remained was the grim reality of survival. I looked around at the men still standing beside me. Some were older than me, some younger, but they all shared the same empty look in their eyes. The war had taken everything, our youth, our lives, our souls, and in return, we had nothing. We had nothing to show for all the pain and suffering. The world we once knew was gone, and there was no going back. As we retreated, I heard the sound of the enemy's artillery firing in the distance, and I knew that this was the end. We had been sent to fight, to die for a cause that no longer existed. The soldiers around me moved like ghosts lost in the fog of war. We weren't soldiers anymore. We were just men, trying to make it through one more day. And yet, even in the midst of all the destruction, there was a small flicker of something deep inside me. A hope, perhaps, a hope that after all this we would survive, that we would be able to walk away from the madness. But I knew better than to believe it. The war had taken too much from us. It had left nothing behind but silence. As we continued to fall back, I looked back at the battlefield one last time. The smoke was thick in the air, and the distant sound of gunfire echoed across the landscape. The war was over, but it was a hollow victory, and I wondered, what would we do now? How would we live in a world that had been torn apart by the same madness that had consumed us? The war had taken everything, but even in the face of all that loss, I couldn't help but wonder if there was still something left inside us, a part of us that had survived the darkness, a part of us that still believed in something, even if we didn't know what it was anymore. When the armistice was finally signed, it felt like a dream. The war had ended, yes, but we were too far gone to feel any joy. The guns had fallen silent, but the battle within us was far from over. It was as if the world had stopped moving, but we had been left behind, stuck in the broken moment between the end of war and the harsh reality of what came after. The peace we had fought for felt distant, a faint echo of the horrors we had survived. We stood there, on the edge of the battlefield, our rifles slung over our shoulders, too exhausted to care about anything anymore. The young soldiers, those who had been drafted into this madness at the last moment, looked lost. They had no idea what the world would be like now. None of us did. We didn't celebrate. There were no cheers, no flag waving. There was nothing. The war had stolen our ability to feel joy, and even the thought of returning home seemed like a cruel joke. What home could we return to? The world we once knew was gone, replaced by a cold, indifferent reality. The ruins of the front lines, the shattered cities, the endless fields of death. We could not escape them, not even in the quiet that followed the end of the fighting. We had been told time and again that the war would be over soon, that the enemies we faced would fall, and we would emerge victorious. But the victory had never been ours. The world had changed, and we had changed with it. The men I fought alongside, the comrades I had relied on, were all different now. Some were dead, others too broken to recognize. And I was no longer the man I had once been. The war had taken that from me as well. We made our way back to the rear, walking through the remnants of the battlefield like ghosts. The mud had dried, but it still clung to our boots, as if the earth itself wanted to remind us of the destruction we had caused. The land around us was barren, the air still heavy with the scent of smoke and decay. The silence that surrounded us was suffocating, and yet there was something almost comforting about it. The chaos had stopped, but the world was still shattered. As we walked, I found myself reflecting on what we had lost. I had lost so much, so many friends, so much of myself. There were no words for it, no way to explain the emptiness that gnawed at me. The war had been our life for so long that it had consumed everything else. We had given everything to it, and now there was nothing left. Nothing but the cold wind and the distant memories of those we had lost. I looked around at the soldiers beside me, each of them carrying their own weight of loss. Some were numb, their faces hollow, their eyes distant. Others walked with their heads down, as if they couldn't bear to face what had become of the world. There was no camaraderie now, no bond between us. We had all been broken by the war in different ways, and there was no going back. We made our way into the ruins of a village that had once been a thriving community. Now it was little more than rubble. The buildings were burned, their walls blackened and charred. There were no sounds of life, no movement. It was as if the village had been abandoned long before the armistice was signed. The houses that had once sheltered families were now nothing but skeletons, their windows shattered, their doors blown off their hinges. The fields that had once fed a community were now barren, the crops destroyed by the bombardment. We found shelter in what remained of an old barn. It was empty, save for the occasional rat scurrying across the floor. The smell of mildew and decay hung in the air, and the silence was oppressive. We sat down, exhausted, our bodies sore and broken. There were no beds, no food, no comfort, just the hard ground beneath us and the weight of everything that had happened. As the hours passed, I found myself staring at the walls of the barn, lost in thought. My mind kept returning to the faces of those we had lost, the men who had died beside me on the battlefield. I could still see their faces, hear their voices in my mind. They were gone, and I was still here. I couldn't understand why. Why had I survived when so many others had fallen? The war had taken so much from me. It had taken my youth, my innocence, my belief in something greater than myself. It had stolen my comrades, my friends, and the very essence of who I had once been. And now, with the war over, it seemed like there was nothing left, nothing but the rubble, the silence, and the deep, unshakable feeling of emptiness. I closed my eyes and tried to sleep, but the images of the battlefield still haunted me. The faces of the men who had fallen, the screams of the wounded, the endless explosions and gunfire. It was all still there, lodged deep in my mind. The war had never truly ended for me. It had become a part of me, woven into the fabric of my being. I would carry it with me for the rest of my life, and I knew deep down that I would never be free of it. The silence of the barn was broken only by the occasional creak of the wood as the wind blew through the cracks in the walls. The world outside had quieted, but the war still raged within us. We had survived, yes, but at what cost? We were no longer soldiers. We were survivors, broken and lost in a world that had been torn apart by the very war we had fought in. The days that followed the signing of the armistice were a blur. The war had ended, but its grip on us was far from over. We had been told to return home, to make our way back to the cities and villages we had once known. But the path back was not the same. There was no grand return, no warm welcomes. The world we left behind had crumbled, and in its place was a fractured, broken reality. We were transported back in trucks, our bodies sore and exhausted, our minds too numb to comprehend what had just happened. The silence between us was deafening. No one spoke. What could we say? The words we had once shared, jokes, hopes, dreams, were gone. What did we have to say now? All that remained was the weight of what we had experienced, what we had lost. As we made our way through the countryside, the destruction became more apparent. The landscape had been ravaged by the war. Fields that had once been lush and green were now barren, their crops destroyed by bombs. The villages we passed were in ruins, their buildings burned to the ground, their streets empty. The people we encountered were different too. The faces were gaunt, tired, as if they had witnessed the same horrors we had. There was no celebration, no sense of relief. There was only the quiet acknowledgement that the war had taken everything, and it was hard to imagine a way forward. When we arrived at the train station, there was a moment of hesitation. The soldiers around me had lost their bearings, unsure of where to go or what to do. The train station was crowded with people, many of them displaced, survivors of the war who had nowhere to go. The air was thick with the stench of sweat, fear, and the remnants of destruction. The station, once a bustling hub of life, was now a lifeless shell of its former self. I stood there for a moment, watching the people moving around me, and I realized that I no longer belonged here. The world I had known was gone. I wasn't the same man who had left for the front lines. The war had taken that man, along with everything he had once believed in. What was left now? A broken body, a shattered mind, and a heart full of questions that would never be answered. The train ride back was long, and the landscape outside the window was no better than the cities we had passed. It was all the same: ruins, destruction, and an overwhelming sense of loss. I tried to imagine what my life would be like once I returned, but all I could see was emptiness. The world had changed, and I had changed with it. What was I supposed to do now? How could I go back to a life that had no meaning? As the train pulled into my hometown, I felt a strange mix of dread and resignation. I had no idea what to expect. The town was smaller than I remembered, the streets quieter. I stepped off the train, and the familiar sights of home seemed alien to me. The houses were intact, but they felt hollow, as if the people who had once lived here had disappeared. There were no crowds waiting for us, no signs of celebration, just the quiet, distant echoes of a life that had long since been lost. I made my way through the town, passing familiar places, the bakery, the old church, the square where I'd once met my friends. But everything was different now. The world had moved on, and I was stuck in a moment that would never return. The people who once filled these streets were no longer the same. They had suffered too, and they had their own scars to carry. I reached my house, and there was a moment of disbelief. The door was still there, the same door I had left behind years ago, but it was as if I was standing on the threshold of a different life. I opened the door and stepped inside, and for the first time in what felt like forever, I was home. But there was no warmth, no joy. The rooms were empty, and the silence was deafening. My family was gone, lost to the war or scattered in the chaos that followed. I had no idea where they had gone or if they had even survived. The house was empty, and so was I. I wandered through the rooms, touching the furniture, running my fingers along the walls, but it felt like a dream. There was no connection to this place anymore. It was just another ruin, another casualty of the war. I went outside and sat on the steps, staring at the street in front of me. The war had taken everything, my family, my friends, my sense of purpose. And now it had taken the one thing I had hoped would remain, home. This place, this town, was a shadow of what it had been. And I too was a shadow of the man I once was. As the days passed, I tried to find some semblance of normalcy. I went to the town square, visited the old places, but nothing felt right. The world I had known was gone. I was no longer a soldier, but I wasn't sure what I was anymore. I was just a man who had survived, a man who had been left behind. The silence that had followed the war was deafening. There were no celebrations, no ceremonies, no speeches about the end of the war. There was just a quiet emptiness that filled every corner of the town, every part of me. The war had taken everything, and now, in the silence that followed, there was nothing left but the echoes of the past. It's strange, isn't it? How you can come back home and yet still feel like you've never left. I walk through the streets now, passing the same houses, the same landmarks I once knew so well. But everything is different. The faces I once knew are gone, replaced by strangers who walk with their heads down, their eyes avoiding contact. It's as if the entire town is holding its breath, waiting for something that will never come. Life moves on, of course. The world outside is rebuilding, slowly but surely, but I can't seem to catch up. I feel like I'm walking in a fog, each step taken with hesitation. I hear the distant sounds of children laughing in the streets, but the laughter is hollow to me. I try to smile at them, try to remember what it was like to be carefree, but it's impossible. The war has stolen that from me. It's stolen everything. I try to occupy my time with the small tasks of life, working in the fields, repairing what I can, fixing the house. I try to make things right, to bring some order to the chaos. But the weight of what I've seen hangs over me, a constant reminder that nothing will ever be the same. The men I fought beside, the friends I lost, They're all gone now, and in their absence, I am left with a hollow feeling that nothing can fill. I spend my nights alone, sitting by the fireplace, staring into the flames. The warmth of the fire should comfort me, but it doesn't. I can hear the sound of shells exploding, the screams of the wounded, the cries of my comrades in the distance. They're still with me in my mind, and no matter how hard I try to forget, they always return. The war is over, but it isn't over for me. It never will be. Sometimes I hear the faintest sounds in the night, footsteps, whispers, but when I turn to look, there's nothing there. I know it's just the ghosts of the past, creeping in when I least expect it. I've come to accept them, these ghosts. They are part of me now, as much a part of me as the scar on my chest, the one I received in the trenches all those years ago. I don't speak much anymore. The words I once knew feel useless now. What's the point of talking when no one truly understands? The war has left us all in the same place, alone, disconnected from the world around us. We survived, yes, but in surviving, we lost everything that made life worth living. I don't know what I'm supposed to do now. I don't know how to live in a world that's moved on without me. There are days when I wonder if I even belong here anymore. The war has changed me in ways I can't explain. The man I was before the trenches, before the endless days of bloodshed, is gone. He was a dream, a ghost. I don't know who I am now. I'm just a man who has survived, a man who has lost everything. What do you do with a life like that? I try to reach out, to connect with the others who came back, but it's difficult. Some of them have already found their places in the new world. They've moved on, or at least they pretend to. They've rebuilt their lives, found families, made homes, but I can't seem to do that. I try to fill the emptiness with work, with small distractions, but it never works. The emptiness is still there, lurking just beneath the surface. I have a dream sometimes, one that I can't shake. I dream that I'm back in the trenches, back in the thick of the fighting. The sound of gunfire is deafening. The ground shakes beneath me and the mud pulls at my feet, dragging me down. But then in the dream, I see something, a flicker of light, something beyond the war, and I reach for it, but no matter how hard I try, I can't grasp it. It slips away just out of reach. It's the same in waking life. I try to find something to hold on to, something that will give me a reason to keep going. But the war has taken so much from me that I'm not sure if anything is left to fight for. What do you do when there's nothing left? What do you do when the world you knew has crumbled, and all that remains is the shadow of what once was? There are times when I think of the men who fought beside me, the comrades who died in the mud, the boys who never had the chance to grow up. I think of the faces of the soldiers I killed, their eyes wide with fear or disbelief, and I wonder, what were we really fighting for? What was the point of all the bloodshed, the death, the destruction? The truth is, I'll never know. No one ever will. The war was just an endless cycle, a machine that devoured everything in its path. And when it was over, there was nothing left but the wreckage. We are the wreckage, the survivors, who have been left to sift through the ruins, trying to find something that makes sense. But there's nothing left to find, nothing but silence. And so I sit day after day in this house that was once a home, staring into the fire, wondering how much longer I can keep pretending that life is still worth living. The war has taken everything, and in the end, all that's left is the echo of the past. a past that will never let me go.